So the language of telegraph displaced a fiduciary relationship, trust, between writer and the reader with a coordinated one. Okay. Yeah.
Like this section makes it sound like the telegram was Babel 2.0. Like rather than a tower, but like the restoration of like, because language had to be flattened into something everyone used, everyone speaks the same language, it brought Babel into my mind.
Yeah, and then you have all these religious people talking about how it's going to like create peace on earth. so that's like
that's probably what they thought about the tower too.
Yeah.
They had it when they started building the tower. Oh, similarly, the telegraph eliminated the correspondent who provided letters that announced an event, described it in detail, and analyzed its substance, and replaced him with the stringer who supplied the bare facts. As words were expensive on the telegraph, it separated the observer from the writer. Not only did writing for the telegraph have to be condensed to save money, telegraphic, in other words, but also from the marginal notes and anecdotes of the stringer, the story had to be reconstituted at the end of the telegraphic line, a process that reaches high art with the news magazines, the story divorced from the storyteller. But as every constraint is also an opportunity, the telegraph altered literary style. In a well-known story, Cabal influenced Hemingway's style, helping him to pare his prose to the bone, dispossessed of every adornment. Most correspondents chafed under its restrictiveness, but not Hemingway. I had to quit being a correspondent, he told Lincoln Steffens later. I was getting too fascinated by the lingo of the cable. But the lingo of the cable provided the underlying structure for one of the most influential literary styles of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
There is something about if you have to get to the bare bones, that there is something to like pulling out only the quality and the like, you know, getting to the real truth of the matter, at least like in Hemingway's thing. I've heard this with like Twitter, like some people's like it helps them to really like hone their thoughts down and like, I don't know, maybe it's like their version of essay writing. They're like, okay, what do I really want to say? But then like I think for the vast majority of people, it ends up like they go the hubris route. So
I do like they noted the way it separated the story from the storyteller.
Right.
Because like, and the observer of the story. The distancing there is interesting. There were other effects, some obvious, some subtle. If the telegraph made prose lean and unadorned and led to a journalism without the luxury of detail and analysis, it also brought an overwhelming crush of such prose to the newsroom. In the face of what was a real glut of occurrences, news judgment had to be routinized, and the organization of the newsroom made factory-like. The reporter who produced the new prose moved into prominence in journalism by displacing the editor as the archetype of the journalist. The spareness of the prose and the sheer volume of it allowed news, indeed forced news, to be treated like a commodity, something that could be transported, measured, reduced, and timed. In the wake of the telegraph, news was subject to all the procedures developed for handling agricultural commodities. It was subject to rates, contracts, franchising, discounts, and thefts.
A second site for the investigation of the telegraph is the domain of empire. Again, it is best not to assault the problem as an overarching theory of imperialism, but rather to examine specific cases and specific connections. The role of the telegraph in coordinating military, particularly naval operations, the transition from colonialism, where power and authority rested with the domestic governor, to imperialism, where power and authority were reabsorbed by the imperial capital, the new forms of political correspondence that came about when the war correspondent was obliged to use the telegraph, and the rise of the first forms of international business that could be called multinational. While the growth of the empire and imperialism had been explained by virtually every possible factor, little attention had been paid to telegraphy in generating the ground conditions for the urban imperialism of the mid-19th century and the international imperialism later in the century. It's probably no accident that the words empire and imperialism entered the language in 1870, soon after the laying of the transatlantic cable. Although colonies could be held together with printing, correspondence, and sale, the hold, as the American experience shows, was always tenuous over great distance. Moreover, in colonial arrangements, the margin had as much power as the center. Until the transatlantic cable, it was difficult to determine whether British colonial policy was being set in London or by colonial governors in the field, out of contact and out of control. It was the cable and the telegraph, backed, of course, by sea power, that turned colonialism into imperialism, a system in which the center of empire could dictate rather than merely respond to the margin. The critical change lay in the ability to secure investments. There was no heavy overseas investment until the control made possible by cable. The innovation of the telegraph created, if not the absolute impetus for imperial expansion, then at least the wherewithal to make the expansion theoretically tenable. But it also created a tension between the capability to expand and the capacity to rule. The scaling problems, right? With the development of the railroad, steam power, the telegraph, and cable, a coherent empire emerged based on a coherent system of communication. In that system, the railroad may be taken as the overland extension of the steamer or vice versa, and the telegraph and the cable stood as the coordinating, regulating device governing both. Although the newspaper and the imperial offices are among the best sites at which to look for the effects of the telegraph, there are humbler locations of equal interest. It surely is more than an accident that many of the great 19th century commercial empires were founded in the humble circumstances of the telegraph's operator's shack. The case of Richard B. Sears of North Redwood, Minnesota is instructive. One must not forget that Edison and Carnegie began the same way, and that the genius of Jay Gould lay in his integration of the telegraph with the railroad. The significance of the telegraph in this regard is that it led to selective control and transmission of information. The telegraph operator was able to monopolize knowledge, and if only for a few moments along a route, this brought a selective advantage in trading and speculation. But it's the same control of information that gave the telegraph a central importance in the development of modern gambling and the business of credit. Finally, it was central to late 19th century explosion in the form of merchandising, such as the mail order house. In the balance of this essay, I want to cut across some of the developments and describe how the telegraph altered the ways in which time and space were understood in ordinary human affairs, and in particular, to examine a changed form in which time entered practical consciousness. To demonstrate these changes, I wish to concentrate on the development of commodity markets and on the institutionalization of standard time. But first, let me reiterate the basic argument. The simplest and most important point of the telegraph is that it marked the decisive separation of transportation and communication. When I first read that sentence, the very beginning of this, I had to read it 10 times. It really, my brain was like, wait, what? Separation of transportation and communication? It didn't flow through. I really had to grok it out.
That the nature of the vehicle of communication had always been transportation until then? There always had to be a person carrying the message.
I just wasn't used to thinking about transportation having anything to do with communication. I wasn't thinking about communication in terms of actual physical space. And now I think about that a lot. Yeah. But yeah, when I first read this, it was wait, what does transportation have anything to do with this? And now I'm like, oh, it has everything to do with all of this. So it's just interesting. Until the telegraph, these words were synonymous. The telegraph ended that identity and allowed symbols to move independently of geography and independently of and faster than transport. I say decisive separation because there were premonitions earlier of what was to come. And there was, after all, pre-electric telegraphy, telegraphy, line of sight signaling devices. Virtually any American city of any vintage has a telegraph hill or a beacon hill, reminding us of these devices. They relied on shutters, flaps, discs, or arms operating as for semaphoric signaling at sea. They were optical rather than wiring at a distance, systems and forerunners of microwave networks, which rely on relay stations on geographic high points for aerial transmissions. Where are we?
You got this last one, and I'll go.
Yeah. Line of sight telegraphy came into practical use at the end of the 18th century. Its principal architect was a Frenchman, Claude Chappe, who persuaded the Committee of Public Instruction in post-revolutionary France to approve a trial. Joseph Lecano, one of its members, reported back to the committee on the outcome. What a brilliant destiny. Do science and arts not reserve for a republic which, by its immense population and the genius of its inhabitants, is called to become the nation to instruct Europe? That meant nothing to me. Okay.
To approve a trial of the telegraph, I would assume.
Line of sight telegraphy became practical use. Persuaded to prove a trial of the line of sight. Okay, like mountain to mountain. What brilliant destiny.
Claude Chappe killed line of sight telegraphy by getting the Committee of Public Instruction to try telegraphy or the telegraph.
Okay.
And then
There's
said,
the
what
French are always
brilliant
learning things.
destiny to do science. Yeah. Okay. The National Convention approved the adoption of the telegraph as a national utility and instructed the Committee of Public Safety to map routes. The major impetus to its development in France was the same as the one that had led to the wave of canal and railroad building in America. The pre-electric telegraph would provide an answer to Montesquieu and other political theorists who thought France or the United States too big to be a republic. But even more, it provided a means whereby the departments that had replaced the provinces after the revolution could be tied to and coordinated with the central authority. The pre-electric telegraph was also a subject of experimentation in America. In 1800, the line of sight system was opened between Martha's Vineyard and Boston. Between 1807 and 1812, plans were laid for a telegraph to stretch from Maine to New Orleans. The first practical use of line of sight telegraphy was for the transmission of news of arriving ships, a practice begun long before 1837. But even before line of sight devices had been developed, alterations in shipping patterns had led to the separation of information from cargo, and that had important consequences for international trade. He'll say more on that later.
Despite the reservations and qualifications, the telegraph provided the decisive and cumulative break of the identity of communication and transportation.
Wait a minute. I'm going to take a decisive and cumulative break and